Okay, good evening. Fantastic to see so many of you here this evening for this event, part of the public program of the Uzbekistan Pavilion. I would like to invite anybody who plans, excuse me, I'll step aside, to take part in this conversation, to hang, to stay for the conversation, to take a seat. This is a garden of knowledge. The idea is to create a space for conversation and exchange, so please feel free to sit down anywhere on the steps around us. Sheda, should we go there or here is okay? Okay. So maybe, yeah, we're going to sit on this side, and I'll start by introducing myself and Sheda. We are the co-curators of this pavilion, the Pavilion of Uzbekistan 2022, and we've been throughout the past months activating through a series of dialogues and conversations that somehow intersect a very broad network of people, not all of whom are from the world of art and design, to join in a conversation, in a series of conversations in this space. And the idea of the space, like I was saying before, is to create set inside the Biennale of Art, a platform of knowledge and exchange of knowledge, a garden, the way we refer to it as a garden of knowledge. So it's not to present so much a single work, but to create a space for dialogue. Sheda, maybe would you like to say a few words about the origins of the project before we introduce our guests for today?
Sure. Thank you all for coming, and especially thanks to our guests, Ercilia and Sarah. And unfortunately, other guest, philosopher Leonardo Caffa, had to cancel last minute. So the origin of the pavilion is like we started working on the origin of the word algorithm, on the roots of algorithm, which goes back to the today's Uzbekistan, a region in Uzbekistan which is called Khiva, and a polymath from Khiva whose name is Al-Khwarazmi, which was born in 9th century in today's Uzbekistan. Al-Khwarazmi is the man who introduced Indian numeric to the world through his important mathematical text. And in 12th century, it has been translated into Latin, into Dixit algorithmi, and actually not a lot of people know that the word algorithm comes from the word Al-Khwarazmi, so algorithmi turned into the algorithm. We've been doing a lot of research in Uzbekistan, and we came to the pavilion, and for designing the pavilion and garden and knowledge, we were inspired by the tenure of Al-Khwarazmi in Baghdad, in House of Knowledge, where he was in charge of gathering a lot of polymaths and intellectuals to gather around and discuss the science, the day's science, and translating important world texts into Arabic and other way around. So inspired by that, we imagined the House of Garden. There's no House of Knowledge. There's no document left from the House of Knowledge itself. So we decided to imagine it as a garden, Islamic garden. So we get into bring in some elements, important elements like water. So we use the reflective floor as a symbol of water, or hanging flowers, hanging trees of Islamic garden, and there are these podiums where people can sit down and join the conversation with different polymaths from around the world.
Fantastic. So I think at this point it would be great to introduce our guests this evening. And I'm going to start from, apologies if I read from the screen, but that's what we are today without paper. So our first guest is Sarah Shin. Sarah Shin is a writer, publisher, and curator whose work includes making books, text, gardens, games, scents, portals, and practices. She co-founded Ignota, I'm not sure how you pronounce it in English, a creative publishing and curatorial house exploring consciousness, technology, and healing, and Silver Press, the feminist publisher. She's also the founder of New Suns, a curation and storytelling project which began as a literary festival at the Barbican. And I should add that Sarah has, through her publishing house, recently released an amazing book, Atlas of Anomalous Ai, which I believe is part of the Ignota project. But maybe you can tell us more about that in a moment. Our second guest this evening is Ercilia Vaudo Scarpetta, who graduated in astrophysics at La Sapienza University in Rome, where she initially worked at the Department of Cosmology on experiments for measuring the anisotropy you'd have to of the cosmic background radiation. Since then, she's been working at the European Space Agency since 1991, in fact, for a very long time, where her most recent role was as Chief Diversity Officer. But more recently, actually, she's been spending quite some time here in Italy, normally based in France. But she was the main curator of Unknown Unknowns, which is the 23rd Triennale di Milano, currently on show in Milan, which we at Space Caviar had the privilege of collaborating on through the exhibition design. But Ercilia, a lot of her work has been really around the idea, I could say, of really going beyond simply cosmic exploration and looking at cosmic intelligence. And I think that that's also a central theme of the Triennale. So that is, in fact, our topic for the conversation this evening. And how would you like to do, Shida? Shall we introduce the topic briefly? Okay, I'm going to just start with the first paragraph of the way that we wanted to kind of frame the conversation this evening. In a recent paper titled The Autodidactic Universe, a group of physicists working at Microsoft put forward the theory that the laws governing the cosmos amount to nothing less than an evolutionary learning system. So in other words, I should add that this series of conversations was conceived over a year ago, and this was something that had, at the time, really been quite widely discussed in the news. The idea that, and I think it kind of also goes back to the idea that has been put forward for a very long time in science fiction of the idea of the world as a kind of a simulation. But in a way, this the theory that was put forward, the idea of a kind of a cosmic intelligence in which the whole of the universe is a learning system, was something that was quite intensely discussed, because it presupposed the idea of an intelligence which is not human. And in fact, the reason that we were interested in devoting the last of this series of conversations, the latest in the series of conversations, to this topic was also to place it in dialogue with a theme which I think preoccupies us all quite intensely right now, which is the theme of artificial intelligence. And so I think it could be interesting to start off this conversation by asking, by investigating a little bit this idea of intelligence that is so much at the center of our reflections in this particular moment in history, and yet that somehow escapes from our ability to fully define exactly what it is, particularly in the moment in which we begin to question whether the human being, whether the human consciousness actually has a monopoly over intelligence. So, for example, this idea that of anomalous artificial intelligences, or the idea that the cosmos could possibly be a form of intelligence or a self-learning system. And that, in fact, I'll start by asking you, Ercilia, maybe having emerged from this extremely intense experience of curating Unknown Unknowns, which is really as it defines itself, an introduction to mysteries. What has this process of interacting with so many amazing, really not just designers, not even just artists, but also physicists and philosophers and figures from really every corner of, I think, human knowledge, led you to, how has this reflection process left you in this thinking about what is known and what is intelligence?
Thank you very much, Joseph, and it's a very interesting point of starting point, intelligence, because actually the thematic of the triennale is what we don't know. What we don't know, we don't know. So it's even, in a way, a way to challenge the intelligence. And certainly, I mean, we are in a moment where this is even more important. I just read recently that through artificial intelligence, if you give, let's say, the computer the information about what we observe, they came out with general relativity, and they came out with things. So how you make these things explicable, and then you see a theory emerge. So more in the sense of a computer that is able to put together pieces that maybe we have not yet been able to. So through the unknown, what was clear is that the thematic of how we confront what we don't know, and feeling also a little nothing in a universe that in a way can very well do without us. It has, in a way, busted and unleashed a lot of creativity, scientific creativity, artistic, designer, projectual creativity. So it's certainly one of the probably most profound and existential topic, because some way or another you confront yourself with a certain kind of question. As well, the question of, okay, we all come from the stars, we are all, in a way, made of those components, but at which moment this has become consciousness is also, I think, something that art and science are constantly confronting with that. So what is the intelligence? I have to say that, in a way, just to something that is happening, what is it, the intelligence, and how far the intelligence brings us. We have been able to go to the moon 52 years ago. We still are not able to go back to the moon. So what does it mean? What is, in terms of innovation, it's something that then gradually becomes part of a knowledge that we can, on which we can count on, or is something that can be ephemeral, something that really can, in a way, evaporate, and you have holes in knowledge, although the knowledge was there. So this, first of all, is something that in this moment is very much thinking about this aspect. And the other aspect is also the intelligence, and intelligence in a way should, what is for, okay? What is intelligence for? To live better, to know more. This is a question of, personally, I don't have an answer, but I also see, we know the oceans much less than Mars. The pixel that the ability to, the granularity of images on Mars are much more defined and refined than we know about the oceans. We don't know anything about the oceans. And if we want to know more, we disturb, and it's not good for the oceans. So our desire of knowledge is something that can also disturb an equilibrium, can also disturb, in a way, something that should not be known, probably. So intelligence in the sense of what? Of being able to solve an equation, to find the right algorithm. But at the end of the day, I think the intelligence should be the other face of a kind of humility in feeling that it's not because, in a way, we have come to general relativity just by intelligence, by the way, because, I mean, it was all in the mind of Mr. Einstein. He was not able to do that experiments, that we arrive to the fact that time can drop like an apple, or, I mean, amazing stuff that were just coming from imagination. So even not intelligence, I say imagination comes much before intelligence. So what is this intelligence now, and what is the real objective? I think that through the exposition, what was clear is that there is a creativity, and there are questions that don't necessarily need answer, and maybe there are mysteries that we should really preserve, as I said before, because we are part of this. And to this desire of put a grasp and know and go deeper is probably our human nature, but is this the right nature?
I think that's that's a very important and interesting point, this idea of a kind of an indeterminate or non-deterministic understanding of the cosmos, of the universe within which we exist, and the idea that some aspects of that we can't be fully understood, or need to be understood on a different register. And that takes me back to actually a comment that you made just at the entrance, Sarah, that yesterday was an incredibly important day, and that maybe in order to be able to understand the reality around us, we have to have a completely different awareness towards the universe that taps into a completely different spectrum of sensitivities. And maybe you could just give a little bit, because I think also kind of from what I know of your work, that this idea of working on a completely different spectrum is very important. And maybe you could just bring into this kind of forum in which I think really our goal was also to kind of decentralize from the expected points of interest around technology, around algorithms, around intelligences, to kind of really kind of knock those into a completely different park. And I think that's really what your work does.
Okay, thank you so much. There's so many places in which I could start. I might actually loop back to this question of what is intelligence. I feel like it's something which is inherently relational, that we live in an intelligent cosmos, which means that it's an inherently relational cosmos, which is something that means we have to expand our idea of what technology is, for example, our tools, which are conscious things that we use. How do we expand our idea of what technology is to include a whole breadth of consciousness that is usually not accessible to us because of the limitations of our instruments of perception? So that is my human nervous system. So as a human limited by that level of perception, I would be thinking that I want to talk about psychocosmology, which is the meeting of the mind, the perceiver, and phenomena. So I couldn't help but think that sitting here, architecturally, spatially, it represents or resembles the descent into the unconscious. So in hypnosis or other practices of dream work, for example, a common script is something that descends. So it's kind of funny to me that we're all sitting on the steps, we're at the precipice, we're at the threshold of going from the normal conscious world of perceivable reality into a space in which our brainwaves, for example, are accessing, say, memories or impressions that have been lost to us by our conscious minds, which seeks to limit what's coming in to make it manageable for us. And I think that's something about how we can perceive what is knowable, as you were saying. So ignota, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly either. It's the Latin pronunciation. It actually comes from Hildegard of Bingen's lingua ignota, Hildegard of Bingen being the 12th century German mystic who invented this language called lingua ignota. We don't know what that language is for. But I saw an exhibition by an artist called Sriwana Spong, in which she speculates that the language contains the words for tools, but not for organic matter. So it contains the word for a fish hook, but no word for a fish. So the speculation is that we live in a post-apocalyptic future in which the tools remain, but the material organic world has decayed or disappeared in some form. So I guess it makes me think of what is the relationship between humans and our tools? What do we think of as technology? I know that in this Biennale, there is the text, The Carrier-Bag Theory of Fiction, which Ignota published back in 2019. And in that, Ursula K. Le Guin seeks to expand the idea of technology or the usage of the term technology beyond something that is, she ties it to a method of narrativization, which is linear, it's heroic, it's for a purpose, and she's saying that that way of thinking about narrative as a tool is quite phallic, actually. It's like the spear, the techno-heroic spear, which is in the service of producing warfare, for example. And she's postulating, drawing upon feminist anthropologist Elizabeth K. Fisher, that actually the first human tool of evolution was a basket. It was a container that enabled us to carry things rather than going out there and hunting mammoths. That was quite meandering, but I hope it answered your question.
No, please.
Okay, I want to pose another question. Maybe it's to both of you, because as Joseph said, like we try to bring two extremes of the discussion into the same place to discuss about. And while we were studying like House of Wisdom and Al-Khwarizmi, I was like personally really interested in astronomers. Okay, astronomers, and who were at the same time were practicing astrology, and like Muslim astrologists who were like in charge of like seeing the destiny from unknowns, which is stars, but you cannot deny the fact that they were totally comparing to the science today, they were totally well-known scientists, knowing the unknown. And I was wondering where these two, the destiny and the unknowns of star, actually meet, and how did they separate, like how you see them separate today as unknown, that you see that this is a mystery that you should not get into it, although you are curating an exhibition on it, which is you like, in your exhibition, actually, you mention it. You don't want to answer to this question. You are not willing to answer this question. You are willing to just pose the question again, the unknown, which has to be left unknown. Or what is the role of astrology now that the science knows a lot of things? Like, where does it sit? Like, how do you justify it? Or not justify it, but how do you see it? How do you read it, if that makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I should also say that ignota actually means unknown. It comes from lingua ignota, unknown language. So it is this opening to, our symbol is a gate, it's a threshold. So like you maybe, it's this kind of, what is that liminal threshold between knowability and unknowability, and what is the method by which we can approach that? So astrology, astronomy, I mean, in the past, obviously, as you know from your research, science has its roots in alchemy. And alchemy, I guess, is, there are many maxims which are actually very similar to computation. So, for example, the law of opposites. You have zeros and ones, and you have yin and yang as another language for describing this movement between polarities that seem to be driven by an inherent patterning to the universe. What is the role of astrology now? I think that it provides a framework for synchronicity, which is what we were talking about before coming in. Yesterday, for those who are interested, was the equinox, which is considered to be, there is an astronomical, observable reality, but then there is something that is meaningful. And that's, I think, the role of human consciousness and our narrative-making abilities. We have our tools, but we have stories about technology, and that's something that's necessary in order for us to be able to make graspable this plethora, the 10,000 things of the Taoists that universal phenomena presents us with. And if we want to make them transmissible to each other as well, and to be able to communicate, because language, according to Anne Carson, is the thing that separates us and yet binds us together at the same time. So that's what astrology can provide. It provides a framework for making something meaningful to us. It is a method of synchronicity. And as well as that, it's just a very beautiful timekeeping system. I mean, as architectural thinkers, astrology is a spatial chronometer. It provides spatial chronometry. Cecilia, would you like to say something?
Yes, so that's true. I mean, Keynes called Newton the last alchemist, and Kepler was actually living out of astrology. And his mother actually was accused of, how you say in English, witchcrafting, and yeah, because of what his son was doing. Is a fantastic story. Kepler was really an amazing, an amazing mind, and but still living out of astrology. Myself, I read the horoscope every day because I tell my husband makes me a better person. Today he told me calm down, so I like to read it, but actually this is something that we touch very much in also in the Triennale exhibition, because it's about time, and time is not necessarily an unknown. We can know time very well. We know, for instance, that we know the universe is expanding, so you see this because the light from the galaxies goes to the red side of the spectrum, so there is a red shift. But there is our neighbor, Andromeda, that the light goes to the blue. There is a blue shift. So Andromeda is really heading towards us, has already swallowed a little galaxy. Milky Way also has swallowed another galaxy some time ago, but is heading to us. We know exactly and for sure, and nothing will save us, that in 4 billion years, there will be, let's say, a crash. It will not be a crash, but this world, as we know it, will change. And the story of the stars, we also show actually a map of 2 billion stars in the Milky Way, in our galaxies, that has been measured by a mission from the European Space Agency, which is called Gaia. Is the most precise. You measure velocity, speed, you measure positions. So we know already today how will be all the night skies for the next 1,600,000 years in front of us. So you have all the horoscopes written in a way. There is no real, in a way, unknown in our horoscopes. Still, what I really, it's clear that, and I go back to Kepler. Kepler was the first one to understanding the influence of the moon on us, and the tides, and how there is, and actually, because of the tides on Earth, the moon is getting away from us 4 centimeters per year. So it's really the orbit enlarged, and it goes. So this reciprocal influence, and that stays still mysterious in a way, and that is its own fascination. You don't need to get to science to feel that. And so the influence that things have on other things is something that, in a way, keeps this idea of a belonging to a kind of destiny where stars, in a way, watch at you and mark a path towards something. And I think it's something that reassures us since ever. And as I said, doesn't matter that we know how will be all those skies. I think is the idea of being in a way master of your destiny within a universe that has its own destiny. This is also something we should say. I think that one of the most amazing things of knowing that there is a Big Bang, 100 years ago, the universe was static, quiet, no movement. And then in 1929, we discovered that there was a beginning. And if there is a beginning, there is a story to tell. So today, the universe, because of this observation, has a story. And this story will have a continuation, a faith, maybe one day an end. But this is also, this is why we are, I think, in a way, so fascinating by the stories. I think it's our, longing for stories.
I really love how you put that, the influence of things upon other things, because that is also the law of correspondences that is Shakespearean in a way, that there is something happens here and there's an effect over there. And we see that in, for example, climate change. And I suppose what you're also saying about if we can think of an origin, then there is a story, as well as this question of what is the influence of things upon other things. It points towards one of the oldest, fields of questioning, which is what is the source, the pattern, and the substance of the universe. And I'm really interested in, for example, pre-thinking about the cosmos as an infinite computer, I think is the phrase. Did people think about this as God? And the monists or the Vedic scholars would have said that the soul consciousness and universal cosmic consciousness are of the same matter, which is very mysterious because we don't necessarily really know what it is. You go smaller and smaller and smaller, and then it goes beyond my personal capacity to understand.
But what there is more mysterious than knowing that energy can become all of a sudden matter, that spirits can become a body,
Yes.
And this happens
Yes.
One way and the other way. Mm-hmm. It's really, with all this the notoriety of E equal MC square, there is really something quite unbelievable to believe. Mm-hmm. This transformation of an attribute in matter. Yes. It's not just as... so it's clear that being all this outside our senses, this is one of the things that for me are more frustrating. We say that there is a dark night, but the night is not dark. Our eyes are dark. We don't see the light there. We see less than other animals, and this is because of our evolution. So we have so much, many more limitations in and we are trapped in our five senses, and still we pretend that this is the whole thing. So I think one of the aspects is really also having, a relation with the fact that our dialogue with what we don't know and what is there, it's so restricted to a little bubble in all the scales. We just cover little scale.
And would you say that that's maybe something that is at the limit of our scientific paradigm? So going back to your question about astrology, the re-emergence of astrology as being so popular is, perhaps indicative of the fact that paradigms change, and our paradigm will be changing. It's clear that there are many things that are wrong with a predominantly materialist understanding of the universe. And I think what you were saying about this movement, this is one of my favorite definitions of magic, which is the ability to move between the subtle and the dense at will. So in the past, if people didn't think that, reality is merely what is observable, but actually you can believe in the existence of non-observable, invisible reality, and that you can influence it by the power of your mind or your will if you train it, then if you believe that, then that happens. There are practices available for making that happen. It's also, there is this kind of circularity where I was reading about quantum weirdness, where one of the facets of quantum weirdness is that reality is changed by its observer, and you will be able to speak much more eloquently about this than me.
I just wanted to add that we'd love to also hear from you in the audience if you have questions, but also responses or reactions to what Ercilia and Sarah are discussing. Please do, we have a mic here that we can share with you. So I don't know if anybody has some kind of burning contributions to add in, but I was also just thinking that one of the things that's interesting about this idea of tools that you brought up before, Sarah, is the kind of the timelessness, and going back to this kind of question of time and how it's one of the most difficult constants, I think, for us to be able to wrap our heads around. One of the things that fascinates, that's really interesting about the work of Al-Khwarizmi, for example, is I think that one of the points that we really wanted to reflect on in this pavilion is how there are certain questions that are in a way timeless or universal to the human spirit, and or our way of responding to the universe around them. And one of these is to build tools. And in fact, when he sat down to write the book that then gave us the word algorithm, it was to create a series of mathematical tools that would allow us to solve very complex problems, which in a way is nothing different than what's happening in Silicon Valley right now, like taking the power of knowledge and science and computation to create tools that can solve apparently incredibly complex problems, and to just break them down into a simple series of steps that can empower humans. And that's something we never think about. We kind of think about that process, about this sort of incredible, I mean, undoubtedly the creativity of contemporary technology, but we think about it as something that's really of the present. We don't think about it as something that's timeless or that has that belongs to the past as well. And so in a way, that's I find this thought incredibly liberating in a way that we are kind of this exceptionalism that defines this moment in history, where we think that we're really unique and we're at a completely different level of intelligence from any generation that preceded us, is actually simply a different, we're framing in a different way a set of problems that are, in a way, are universal and have always been with us. And so I was wondering, I don't know whether either of you have any thoughts on this idea of the present, like how we can escape from the tyranny of the present. And I think in a way it's kind of ironic, like what you were saying, Ercilia, like looking at through Gaia, looking at the James Webb Telescope, that actually we got the first images on the day that your exhibition opened, and that was showing us images from millions of years ago. And we can see back that far in time, but we're unable to see the present. And yet here on Earth, it's the other way around. We're completely, in a way, hostage to the present. And what could be strategies to liberate ourselves from this, in a way, this sort of bubble within which we seem unable to really have long-term thought, thinking about what it means to exist?
Thank you. I wanted to loop back to what you were saying again, that the idea of an origin story, I like to think that there are many beginnings and many ends. So if we start from that premise, then we also know that there is more than one way of understanding what Yuk Hui, the philosophy professor, calls cosmotechnics, that our technology is founded upon cosmology. And you're quite right. Our contemporary cosmology is largely a westernized cosmology, which is also very patriarchal. So our tools are geared towards reinforcing a certain kind of way of being that doesn't need to be the case. Byung-Chul Han wrote a book called The Disappearance of Rituals, in which he talks about the, what does he call it? He relates the endless scroll of the iPhone to the hell of the same. That and he says that that's why rituals are useful, because they contain, provide boundaries, they provide thresholds. And in order for a person to develop or to grow, you know, rituals of life used to include having to go through something so that you go through to the other side, and that is a transformation, and that produces growth. Whereas now, we're often stuck in the limen, which is the endless scroll. And he says that also is the space of addiction, for example, where we confuse the sacred and the profane, where we think that, for example, alcohol is the spiritus, which is God, and we want something that is connective, but we're looking for it in the wrong place.
I just want to say, I mean, also talking about cross-culture, we are talking about time, and actually, I mean, we don't have a sense that is really devoted to feel the passage of time. When we want to talk about time, we have to co-opt, we have to take a language from space. So we say that a weekend has been long, or that time flies, but we use space language to talk about time. This has already an influence. And just to give you an example, we as, I mean, the majority of culture that have also a way of writing from left to right, we have a way to say, I mean, the future is in front of us. and the past is back. While there are many tribus, for instance, in Papua New Guinea or in the Andes, Andes, where they have a completely different perspective, because for them, the past is in front, because we can see it, we know what it is. The future is on the back, because we cannot put our eyes on it. And this is what happens with the universe. When we look in front, we are looking in the past, is James Webb. More we look in distance, more we're looking back in the past. And this is actually this sense of knowing the past and giving a sense of definition of a present, which is emerging, to this, it's the standpoint, and it's a very present standpoint, because what you are looking is already in the past, even a sunset. So we are always in relation with the past. Everything, as from the moon, let's say this is most, you start to see the difference in the time lag. So our present is this constant relation with the past. And I think the fact that we don't have a way really to feel although, in principle, we can even say when a sound hits your left ear and then your right ear, the fact that we don't have a way to feel it and to sense it, and we have to create archetypes and a structure to talk about time, has an influence in the way we feel it.
Yeah. This is a fascinating conversation, thank you. And the question I had was that it's been about 100 years since Einstein's theory of relativity that you referenced with the E equal mc squared. And I just wondered if there was an update on the transformation of energy to matter, and if there's other proof of that that you can elaborate on, because I think that's really a fascinating it's a fascinating concept.
Yeah. Can I just say how it came to this E equal mc squared? Actually, the real revolution starts from the fact that in Newton's time, space was absolute, time was absolute, and velocity was relative. If you ran on a tapis roulant and they watch you from the outside, I see that you are going to a velocity that is the sum of your velocity plus that. So velocity was relative, and space and time were absolute. Then, it's very interesting, because if you think that in 1900, Lord Kelvin, which was an eminent scientist, said that there was nothing more to discover in physics, just to make a little bit more precise measures, and we know what happened in the first 20 years of last century. Actually, the transformation came from the fact that Einstein understood, and was proved, that velocity was absolute. The moment velocity becomes absolute, space and time become relative and become space-time. So they are linked forever to this tango. They had to adjust, because velocity now is the same everywhere. And this creates the sense of a space-time. And because velocity is limited and is constant, usually if you push a car, you put enough energy, the velocity of the car increases. But if the velocity is limited and you keep pushing, it's the mass of the car that gets out, that increases. And then E equal mc squared. So the fact that there is this constant, this promotion of velocity of life, is changed everything. And this comes, all the sense of time can change if you go at the speed of light and so on. But just this idea in an imaginary frame where you didn't need a tool. Let's say this was without tool. It was also, we are still demonstrating the general relativity, or it's something that is also quite impressive. Although he came to this idea because he was working in Bern at the patent office, and they start to, it was the beginning of the 1900s. We had railways, And it was important that midday in Berna was the same midday that in Berlin. Up to that time, no one could care. It was exactly the same midday. And then he came with this, so in a way, pragmatic things, a tool to find, and then, sorry for the...
Thank you.
I wanted to thank you for this question, actually, because it leads me back to something that I was thinking earlier. And this is going to be more, or rather, actually less poetic than what you just said, because I wanted to explore the idea of the equation, what the equal sign really means and what is on either side of the equal sign, because I feel like something that we're kind of speaking around is the simultaneity of the symbolic and the literal. So maybe taking an equation or an equivalence, the idea of equivalence symbolically or more expansively or more in a sideways kind of way gives us room for creativity, bringing together things that seem kind of unexpected between modalities, and perhaps that's kind of fruitful for creating different kinds of equivalences and an expanded idea of what an equation is. I think that's kind of what you were saying in the first instance, so maybe this is a circularity here.
That's a very apt observation, because in fact the equation was one of the things that Al-Khwarizmi's writing introduced to Europe, and it was adopted much later, actually more or less around the time of Hildegard of Bingen, and that's when abacuses, in Europe, abacuses had been done away with much earlier in Indochina, thanks to the work of Al-Khwarizmi, but it was only like 400 years later, around the time of Hildegard of Bingen, that equations actually became the norm for the solution of mathematical problems. So that was really spot on. I thought it would also be appropriate to just say a little bit about the tapping that you can hear in the background, which is, as you can see, it's a piano, but it's actually a piano that's been adapted by the artist Charlie Tapp, who's an artist who works a lot with sound and technology, at the intersection of sound and technology. And his work really uses music as a language to reflect on some of the ways that we think about interaction between people and think about some of the questions that we've been discussing here today. And specifically here, what Charlie did was attempt to address some of the questions around intelligence, and I think kind of trying to take music as a kind of a form of the ultimate expression of intelligence, and to question the idea that that's something that really is necessarily dependent on human authorship. So he actually built this piano that's capable of playing itself, but rather than simply making a kind of an AI that is capable of producing sounds that are pleasing to the ear, in other words, music, he wanted to postulate instead that music requires, or the highest form of musical expression doesn't exclude the use of AI, but is most interesting when it's a collaboration between an AI and human, the millennia of the kind of accumulated knowledge of humans over many millennia. So he built this machine and actually set it up to interface with a Uzbeki musician, Abror Zufarov, who came here during the days of the opening of the exhibition, and played music to the machine. He'd already fed into the piano sets of gigabytes and gigabytes of data about the kind of musical traditions of Central Asia, and then asked the machine to respond in real time to the musician playing. And the amazing thing was that they'd had no chance, they'd never had an opportunity to practice or to rehearse in any way, and yet they succeeded. And I must say it was very moving to see them improvising together, and to see the musician playing and the machine responding, and somehow something completely new that would have never been possible if either of them had been working alone to emerge from this. And so now the sound is switched down for the benefit of this conversation, but afterwards it'll be turned back on again. And what you'll be hearing is essentially a meditation on Zufarov's music that the machine has been continuing to do in the following months. So again, coming back a little bit to this idea that of our relationship with technology, and the idea that we, in a way, need to find new ways of relating to these forms of intelligence that we haven't historically been able to, had the need to relate to, and the opportunities that will open up. So I don't know whether any more interventions from the audience. Here's one.
Hi. Hi, I'm Anastasia. I'm from the PR department of the Pavilion. Thank you for coming. And in fact, I have two questions, both to Sarah and Ursula, and I think I'll start with a question for Ursula. I want to bring up the topic of diversity in the space. Because, for instance, in critical animal studies, they say that people with neurological disorders, brain disorders, have more connection and more able to understand animals. And so I'm wondering if it's kind of the same for cosmos intelligence and people with neurological disorders. Because I also know that there is a project called Astro-Access that basically explores opportunities for people with disorders in the outer space. And I'm wondering if there's something about neurological diversity in this aspect. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Actually, I have to say that space is really still not really a very diverse world. And I mean, if you think we had more than 600 people going into space and barely 12% were women, and although they were ready since the beginning of the 60s. And in this kind of, first of all, the European Space Agency has been the first one, and we will have the selection in 1 month to open a para-astronaut project, because in space we are all disabled, and apart from private flight, we never had people with disability flying to space, or matter of legs or arms. You can very well, it's not an environment where we have evolved, so we are all the same in a way, with the same difficulties. And there is this experiment you were saying, but at least European level, this is really something is not in the radar at the moment, and diversity per se is really a great struggle. It's in a way it's kind of adventure space that is still quite of allow me to say testosteronic kind of a narrative, and I mean we have not so many applications from women to become an astronaut or from a diverse population, and the narrative in exploring is still sometimes linked to conquering or whatever. So there is a lot to do with respect to space, and this is an aspect that for sure is not under consideration, unfortunately.
When you say that there aren't that many applications from women and we're talking about diversity in space, does that mean that we should look a bit more at the conditions and the context on Earth, where women, still retain primarily a lot of burden for childcare, for example? It's just a lot more difficult, and also physically as well. And a question about diversity, I think, leads us back to thinking about what the norm is. So this may be, you may know this quotation already, but New Suns, the project that Joseph mentioned earlier, the name of that is borrowed from Octavia Butler's third and unfinished Earthseed novel in her trilogy, where there's a community that ultimately is founded by this young character called Lauren, and their destiny, she believes, is to go and live in the stars, to return to where they came from, and to found a better society there, because California of this America in which there is a presidential candidate whose slogan is "Make America Great Again," she really was a prophet, is no longer livable. And that quotation, or the epigraph, was, "There is nothing new under the sun, but there are new suns." So we have different patterns and norms that we can then diverge from, perhaps.
Still, I think it's a pity that sometimes it's presented as a way to escape or to run away, and while in a way the attention should really be on where we are now and keeping all the solutions possible for. So there are many other suns, we know now for sure, and James Webb actually, there are millions of exoplanets now, so you see how multiplies also the possibilities. But I still see that space is considered as a way to escape, and I remember just an anecdote. I was 4 years in Washington, D.C., working in the relations with NASA. And at that time, Bush was announcing, because there was the Columbia accident, so the shuttle that exploded on the way back, to go back to the moon. So I went back to my son, he was 5 years old, and I said, look, the Americans want to go back to the moon, it's fantastic. And he said, oh, it's really fantastic, so we can stay here. And I think the perspective of a little guy that I would have imagined, yes, let's go, but was no, let's stay here. It's also something that maybe is very European, I don't know, but yes, I see the exploration sometimes is sold as a way to, to escape and not to take a responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that escapism or viewing space as this kind of other is something that relinquishes the responsibility to, again, be in relation, not just to the extraterrestrial reality around us, but to each other, because there's a lot of work to be done, especially around gender and race, etc. still.
The mentioning of the exoplanet reminded me of the Portugal pavilion, the vampires in space, where the vampires are sent to exoplanet because they are immortal, and it's always night in this space, so they can fly forever. But my question is for Sarah. I wanted to ask you about artificial intelligence and predictive models, because I know that in Ignoto books you published the book called Pharmaco-AI, and that you kind of explore this relation between mysticism and technologies. And I wanted to ask, how do you foresee this kind of thing?
I couldn't say that I foresee anything. In fact, I think that Ignoto's approach to AI, we published a book called the Atlas of Anomalous Ai, which seeks to trace the unconscious of AI development today. So really it's stretching far back into the past, looking at things such as the I Ching and Quechua, the counting knots of the Incans, to trace a slightly less expected history of what informs our idea of artifice and intelligence. And kind of going back to this piano, I was thinking that for Pharmaco-AI, which was, for those who don't know it, it's the first book ever to be co-created with the language model GPT-3. And the human author, Kenrika Lada-McDowell, who is also the lead on Google's Artist and Machine Intelligence program, they started experimenting with GPT-3 during the pandemic. They had early access, and they were just kind of messing around, feeding it diary entries, and then quickly was quite surprised by what transpired, and they were drawn into this 2-week-long fugue state in which they were kind of seeing themselves reflected in this language AI, because GPT-3 is trained on something like 3 or 4 terabytes of the human written word. So it's basically everything that has ever been written by humans. And it's quite creepy. You can see in the text the moment where Kenrick is a little bit shocked at what is coming up here. And they do compare it to both scrying and spelunking, and also playing. To write well with GPT-3, you have to be able to play it like a synthesizer. There is variables that need to be moderated and inflected with whatever kind of output you want from it. And I guess play is something that's an interesting metaphor that comes up in relation to AI, because it is a counterpart to you. And the idea of playing or an instrument or music is, again, it's a container for any number of randomness to produce something that looks like form or a game or something that is, has its own sets of rules. I don't know if that makes any sense or answered your question, so I don't foresee anything.
Hi, welcome. Yeah, it was very interesting listening to you, so thanks. Also, this room is really beautiful, and especially this reflection is quite nice. And so when you look in this reflection as well, there's some symmetry involved, right? And we know a lot of laws in physics are kind of symmetric when it comes to time. So if you invert time, you kind of get the same results. But there's one particular phenomena which kind of has an arrow in time, which is entropy, right? And so entropy is also used a lot in artificial intelligence, but also a way to explain quantum entanglement, information theory in general, maybe intelligence, like not non-artificial intelligence, but real intelligence. So I was kind of wondering, what are your thoughts on entropy? And in particular, do you think it's a fundamental theory, like information is fundamental, elementary, and therefore as well entropy? Or do you think it's more of a descriptive, effective theory? So that's the question.
I think entropy is really a very profound and concept for what you say, linking time, because you're right. If we didn't have, in a way, this direction of time coming also from, let's say, the Big Bang, in a way, the law of physics are completely reversible. You can crush a glass and get it back, just inverting. But because of entropy, and this link between time and information is fantastic, and chaos. So entropy really brings together elements that no one, and because we talk about this equation and what does it mean be equal to, no? In a way is what you raise in this space. What does it mean to be equal to? I think it's a very, very, very good question. I don't have an answer myself. I'm very much, there was a book when I was a teenager at school that was Il caso e la necessità di Jacques Monod, The Case and the Necessity. I think it was a Nobel Prize, Jacques Monod. And he was really presenting this idea of how much by knowledge we were, in a way, decreasing the increase of entropy, and how the technology could have, in a way, fought back this increase of entropy. Anyway, the question of linking together information and time and disorder, I think it's very fascinating. We should really have a reflection on this, because these are aspects, and in a way, it's what leads to a destiny. Because if we didn't have this flash, and we could always reverse back and forth, even astrology would not been sense.
I also like this question because it reminds me of this Hermetic maxim of as above, so below. And yes, I can see you reflected speaking in the mirror there, and also as within, so without. So again, it's this corresponding idea of how things relate to each other. But because it's not a mathematical equivalence, this idea of as above, so below, because what is above in that time would have been the realm of God, and what is below is the horizontal plane of the human. So we're speaking about, horizontal vertical axis that predates our idea of, multidimensional space-time. And I'm going to move sideways from multidimensional space-time to something about the soul and inexplicable things there. Because if we're talking about, metaphors, essentially the metaphor to me is the language of the soul, and that's where I give myself over to the mystery.
To me, actually, is interesting because you have a universe that goes to dissipation, and then we want to dissipation versus connection. So how two ways of balancing, and through what Sarah is saying, I think is very interesting.
I think it's also, entropy is a fantastic example of a concept that's central to modern physics and really also astronomy and the kind of the study of the cosmos, but also to the practice of an artist like Smithson, who is really like this idea of kind of a reflection on entropy and a reflection on the passing of time and its effect on matter. Is absolutely key to his work, and I think that's also part of a little bit our ambition with this pavilion is to, in a way, have to reflect on the fact that art is something that art and knowledge are simply different forms of intelligence in the end. And that these are things that will be a constant. And I think your example also of GPT-3, or for example, if you think about even more recently, like Midjourney and DALL-E and so on, these new sort of platforms, some for literary outputs, other for artistic outputs, and all of the kind of scaremongering in the news about how these will replace a certain category of artistic production. But then on the same time, you go over to YouTube and there are all of these tutorials emerging for how to do even more amazing things with these algorithms, essentially, and so the fundamental idea that humans and machines have always collaborated and will always collaborate doesn't necessarily exclude either of them, just like the piano, I think, in a way. So, yeah, but I thought that was a really interesting example. But maybe I know that we're on a timeline, and we have Ercilia. I really want to see the rest of the exhibition as well. So maybe hand over to you, Sheda, to just say some closing thoughts.
No, I just wanted to thank you both for coming, and thank you, rest of you, to stay and stay with us. I just wanted to mention something really interesting that you mentioned. You talked about the notion of future, past, and present being like relative in a certain area of the world, like Madagascar or Andes. And I just wanted to, this is on a lighter note, let's say, there's this simple but witty mystic figure in Central Asia and Iran who is called Khaja or Mullah Nasruddin, who is this mullah, but he's witty. And it is a symbol. We are in the Uzbekistan pavilion, and you can see the figure all over the Uzbekistan representing it. It is like this witty mullah who is sitting on a donkey, but backward. And when you ask about him, why are you sitting backward? He says, like, I'm moving forward, so why should I sit forward? So, and there are a lot of jokes about it, and they always talk about it like this society, which is like going forward, but just in time, but looking like we are moving toward future, but looking always backwards, so that they're playing with this notion. So we are in the pavilion of Uzbekistan, Central Asia, so that is a good example of it. But at the end, I just wanted to thank the Cultural and Art Foundation of Uzbekistan and Gayana Umarova for their support for this pavilion and cultural event that we are holding here, and anyone else?
Also all of the team, all the team who's really, it's a big job keeping a pavilion like this running, as you can imagine, so a big thank you to them all and to the foundation. Yeah, it's been I must say, when we set out to make this pavilion, it was really quite a radical proposition that I think took a little bit of time to be digested. This idea of not actually presenting a work, but presenting a discourse or a platform for discourse. And I must say that it's once again been an incredible success, really been super amazing to have this conversation with you. And thank you both, Ercilia, Sarah, so much for coming so far.